The bus screeched to a halt, the sound of its tires against the pavement slicing through the thick silence. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as the young man's words rang in the air, his voice steady yet full of an intensity she had never heard before. "You're not in control anymore." The tension in the air was so thick it could be sliced with a knife. A single moment that had been brewing for years, decades perhaps, was about to explode. The passengers, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Eleanor, sitting at the back of the bus, had always been silent. She had learned to keep her head down, to blend in, to avoid trouble. But not today. Not anymore. The bus driver, Henry, gripped the wheel as if it were his last lifeline, his knuckles turning white. "You think you can just speak out like that?" he snarled, his voice laced with anger. "You think you're better than me?" But Caleb wasn't backing down. His gaze never faltered. "I'm not better than you, but I'm better than this," he said, his words echoing through the bus like a declaration of war. The air crackled with the weight of his defiance. Everyone was watching, everyone was listening. And yet, it was the deafening silence that followed that made Eleanor's blood run cold. This was no longer just a bus ride. This was a moment that would change everything. Have you ever been in a situation where the silence was more deafening than any words? Where standing up felt like stepping into the unknown, yet you couldn't stay silent any longer? Where do you stand when injustice is right in front of you? Tell us in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Do you feel that same tension in your community? Have you ever been afraid to speak out? This story is just the beginning. Subscribe now and don't miss the next chapter as we dive deeper into the lives of those who dare to stand up and challenge the world around them. Let's explore what happens next. Together, the streets of Birmingham were bathed in the soft golden light of the early morning sun, but even the beauty of the city could not hide the tension that lay beneath its surface. The air was heavy, as though the weight of years of history, of struggle and injustice, pressed down on every corner. The pavement, slick from the night's rain, reflected the hum of the bustling city. Yet, there was a silence here too, a silence that could only be broken by the sound of the rattling old bus that rolled down the street. Eleanor Sanders, a woman of 65 years, stepped onto the bus with the ease of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Her shoes, worn from years of use, met the pavement with a soft thud, the only sound in a world that seemed to hum with anticipation. She adjusted the scarf around her neck and straightened her coat, a simple yet dignified act that reflected her strength. She didn't need to look up to know that the bus was crowded. The scent of coffee mixed with the faint aroma of cigarettes and a hint of something else, something colder, lingered in the air. She walked down the narrow aisle with a steady gait, her eyes never straying from the floor. The sound of her footsteps was drowned by the murmurs of the other passengers, some lost in their own worlds, others eyeing her with something far less familiar. As Eleanor made her way toward the back of the bus, the driver's voice cut through the hum of conversation like a blade. "Hey, you!" Henry Blake's voice boomed from his seat up front. His tone was dismissive, sharp. "Back of the bus! You know the drill." Eleanor didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. She continued walking slowly, deliberately, to the back of the bus. Her every step was measured, but inside, a storm was brewing. It wasn't just the words. It wasn't just the command that had been issued to her, as though she were some kind of lesser being. It was the coldness of it, the way the entire bus seemed to collectively look the other way, pretending it wasn't happening. As she reached the empty seat at the back, Eleanor paused for a moment. Her heart was pounding now, but she didn't show it. Not yet. She sat down, the seat creaking under her, and glanced out of the window, focusing on the world outside. But the world outside for all its early morning beauty, seemed as heavy as the one inside the bus. She had been here before. The stares, the whispers, the judgments, these were familiar, old friends. The kind of friends you never wanted but had learned to accept. In this city, in this world, being a black woman meant enduring those stares. The weight of them was often invisible, but it was always there. And in moments like this, moments when someone tried to push her back, to remind her of her place, the weight of it felt unbearable. Henry Blake, the driver, had never been a stranger to prejudice. He had worn his racism like a badge, unapologetically, proudly. And today, it seemed, was no different. He sneered as he watched Eleanor sit in the back, his eyes narrowing with a cold contempt that cut through the air like a knife. "That's right," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. "Stay where you belong." Eleanor clenched her fists in her lap, but she didn't respond. She hadn't responded in years. What was there to say? Words could only do so much. She had learned that the hard way. The silence was a shield. But today was different. She could feel it. The sharp sting of Henry's words burned deeper than usual. The bus rumbled down the road, its old engine coughing and sputtering. But the rhythmic sound of the bus wasn't enough to drown out the hum of discomfort in the air. The other passengers shuffled in their seats, their eyes flicking between Eleanor and the driver, but no one dared to speak up. They could feel it, the unease in the air, but they weren't brave enough to challenge the system that had always existed. In the back, Eleanor could feel their eyes on her. The silence was heavy. But it wasn't just their silence. It was hers too. It was the silence she had carried for so many years. The silence of someone who had learned to survive in a world that didn't want her to speak. She had learned to ignore the looks, to pretend she didn't hear the whispers, to carry the weight of it all and keep walking. But today, something was different. The bus continued its journey, but Eleanor's mind was elsewhere. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and in that silence, she heard the echoes of her past, the echoes of her mother's voice, her father's face, the struggles they had faced, and the battles they had fought. Her mother had always told her, "No matter how hard they try, no one can take your dignity unless you let them." But sometimes, Eleanor wondered if her mother had truly known how much they had tried to take. The bus jolted as it hit a pothole, and Eleanor's grip tightened on the seat in front of her. The sharp pain in her wrist was nothing compared to the years of pain she had endured, but it was enough to bring her back to the present. She looked up just in time to catch the glance of a young man sitting across the aisle, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. His name was Caleb Johnson, and although he was no more than 25, he had lived a lifetime of lessons about silence. Caleb shifted in his seat uncomfortably. He had seen it all before, but seeing it today, seeing the way Eleanor was treated, hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to speak up. He wanted to say something. But the fear of what might happen if he did, gripped him tightly. "Just keep quiet," he told himself. "It's easier that way." But was it? As the bus continued down the road, Caleb's mind raced. He had been taught to stay quiet, to keep his head down. But what about today? What about this moment? Could he let this happen without doing something about it? He wasn't sure. He turned to look at Eleanor again, her calm face betraying the storm inside her. She had lived through this all her life. But for Caleb, this was new. This wasn't just another day on the bus. This was a moment when he couldn't stay silent anymore. And as the bus rolled on through the streets of Birmingham, it felt as though something had shifted. Something was changing, whether Eleanor was ready for it or not. But Caleb had already made his decision. The bus creaked to a halt at the next stop, the tires squealing in protest as it slowed down, jolting Caleb out of his thoughts. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath until the noise broke his concentration. His heart was racing, the words he wanted to say bubbling at the back of his throat, but still trapped behind the barrier of fear that had held him in check for years. He glanced at Eleanor again. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were fixed out the window, her expression unreadable, but the rigid set of her jaw told him she was far from indifferent. Caleb couldn't help but notice how different she seemed from everyone else on the bus, how much older she looked in that moment, as if the years of injustice and silence had aged her beyond her years. For a brief moment, their eyes met, her gaze steady, unyielding. Caleb wanted to say something, anything. He opened his mouth, but the words died before they left his lips. In that fleeting moment, it felt as though the entire bus had frozen. The low hum of the engine was the only sound, filling the thick silence between them. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers, but they weren't looking at him. They were looking at Eleanor. They all knew what was happening, but no one said anything. It was the same thing they'd seen time and time again. The same routine, the same cruelty, the same silence. But Caleb wasn't like the others. At least, he didn't want to be. But fear gripped him. Fear of what would happen if he spoke up. Fear of being ostracized. Fear of the consequences. The weight of that fear was suffocating, and for a moment, Caleb felt the familiar sting of impotence that had followed him for so long. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the seat in front of him, trying to steady himself. Henry Blake, the driver, glanced at him through the rearview mirror, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Caleb's stomach turned, but he quickly looked away, not wanting to make eye contact with the man who had caused so much harm to someone who didn't deserve it. The next stop came, and a few more passengers boarded, pushing past Eleanor without so much as a glance in her direction. It was the same every day, and every day it felt like the weight of that indifference grew heavier. Caleb's eyes flicked over to Lisa Thompson, sitting a few rows ahead. She was a teacher, someone who, on the surface, seemed like the kind of person who would stand up for what was right. But even now, as Eleanor was being treated like this, Lisa did nothing. She glanced at Eleanor briefly, but quickly looked away, her fingers nervously tapping against the seat. Caleb had known Lisa for years. He had always admired her, her calm demeanor, her grace. But he couldn't help but wonder, was she just another person too scared to do anything? Another person who'd rather turn a blind eye than face the uncomfortable truth? The bus rumbled on, and Caleb's mind raced. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. Why wasn't anyone saying anything? Why wasn't he saying anything? He couldn't stand it anymore. He stood up abruptly, his knees knocking against the seat in front of him. The movement caused a few heads to turn, but no one spoke. He opened his mouth, but for a long moment, no words came. He looked around at the passengers, then back at Eleanor, and finally, with a deep breath, said it. "This is wrong." The words fell from his lips like a stone, heavy and sharp in the silence that followed. Henry didn't even look up at him, but Caleb could feel the tension rising, crackling in the air. He took a step forward, looking down the aisle at the other passengers. "I can't just sit here and let this happen. Not anymore," Caleb said, his voice gaining strength as he went on. "You all see this, don't you? You see what's happening right here, right now, and yet no one says anything." Some of the passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting furtive glances at each other. But still, no one spoke. The weight of the collective silence pressed in on him. Then, unexpectedly, Lisa stood up. Her voice was shaky at first, but she found her footing as she looked directly at Henry. "This is wrong. What you're doing is wrong," she said, her words coming out clearer now, more certain. "I don't care if you're the driver or who you think you are. No one deserves to be treated like this." Caleb turned to look at her, surprised. He'd always thought of Lisa as someone who would just go with the flow. someone who kept her head down. But here she was, speaking out, standing beside him. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Henry's face reddened as he looked at the two of them. "You think you can tell me what to do? You think I care about what you have to say?" His voice was thick with anger, but underneath it, Caleb could hear something else, something weaker, something more uncertain. The mask was slipping. "You don't get to treat people this way," Lisa shot back, her tone hard now. "This isn't just about one person. It's about everyone who has to put up with this every day, just because of who they are." Eleanor sat quietly, but the fire inside her was growing. She had lived with this for so long, suffered in silence for so many years. But this was different. She could feel the change in the air, feel it in the tension between the passengers, in the boldness of Caleb and Lisa's words. The bus jerked to another stop, but it didn't feel like just another stop. It felt like the beginning of something that could change everything. Henry's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but still, he said nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. It was no longer just a silence of compliance. It was a silence of rebellion, a silence that dared to speak. Caleb felt a small spark of hope flicker in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. He looked at Eleanor, sitting there so still, and he knew, in that moment, that change had already begun. The bus continued down the familiar streets of Birmingham, its tires rolling over the cracked pavement, a steady rhythm that somehow seemed to mock the turbulence that had just unfolded. Eleanor sat in the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed out the window. But her mind was miles away, caught in the distant echoes of a time long past. The confrontation earlier, the words spoken by Caleb, and Lisa's defiant stand had shaken something inside her, a quiet yet undeniable shift. It was the same feeling she had gotten when she was younger, when her mother had whispered into her ear, telling her to stand firm, to never let the world take away her dignity. And yet, now, with so much history weighing down on her, Eleanor wondered if she had truly followed those words all these years. She had survived, but at what cost? The voices around her faded into the background as memories flooded back. The memory of a girl, no older than Noah, sitting in the back of a bus much like this one. But back then, the air was different. The city had been different. And the injustice, it had been just as loud, just as crushing. Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering her childhood, the painful weight of racism that had shaped her every move. She had been 8 years old when she first understood the harshness of the world. It was a summer day, the heat oppressive, the air thick with the dust of old roads. Her mother had taken her downtown for an errand, something simple, just a quick trip to the market. But it was never that simple for a black woman in Birmingham in the 1950s. They had boarded the bus, and her mother, as always, had stood tall, head high, as though she could will herself to be invisible, to become part of the background. But even in the crowd, she had been noticed. Eleanor had been sitting beside her, quiet and observant. But that day was the day that changed everything. A white man had approached the driver and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Move her to the back." It was as if his words were a decree, and Eleanor's mother, dignified and patient as always, had just stood there for a moment. Her mother had told her years later that she'd heard the venom in his voice. She'd heard the hate. But she hadn't flinched. She hadn't backed down. That day, Eleanor had witnessed her mother being humiliated, being pulled from her seat, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because of the color of her skin. "Get up, lady," the driver had sneered, forcing her mother to the back of the bus. Eleanor had been frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress. She had watched her mother's proud face transform into something unreadable. That memory, That sting had followed her throughout her life, casting a long shadow over everything she had done since. But it had also shaped her, made her who she was. And as she sat on this bus, decades later, she realized that she was still carrying that burden, carrying it quietly, carrying it alone. But today, something felt different. Something had shifted. The bus hummed along, but Eleanor barely noticed the passage of time. The familiar landmarks, the corner store, the old diner, the quiet park, seemed distant, as if the city itself was moving past her, leaving her behind in the haze of memory. A sudden jolt of the bus pulled her back to the present. She looked up, her mind snapping into focus. She could see Caleb again, sitting across from her, his face a mask of internal conflict. He had spoken up earlier, but that was just the beginning. He was still unsure, still feeling the weight of what he had done. She turned her gaze to Lisa, sitting quietly, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of her purse. Lisa had always been the quiet one, the observer, the one who saw but never spoke. And yet, today, Lisa had stood up. Lisa had found her voice. Eleanor couldn't help but wonder what had changed in her, what had finally pushed her to do what she had never done before. The tension in the bus had not yet dissipated. The murmurs of the passengers still hung in the air, but they were no longer just whispers. They were questions. Questions that didn't have answers yet, but were slowly being demanded by the collective force of those who had seen what had happened. Caleb shifted again, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Lisa, his posture stiff. He opened his mouth to say something but quickly closed it, unsure. Eleanor could feel his discomfort, his fear. She had seen it before. The fear that came when someone realized they had the power to change things but didn't know how to wield it. She wanted to speak, to offer him something, but the words stuck in her throat. She wasn't sure she knew how to help him. She didn't know how to give him the strength to stand, to rise up against the world that had so long told him to sit down, to be quiet. The bus reached its next stop, and more passengers filed in, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. They took their seats, their eyes avoiding Eleanor's, glancing quickly at Caleb and Lisa. But no one said anything. Caleb, noticing the shift in the atmosphere, took a deep breath. He finally stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. He looked at Eleanor once more, as if seeking some kind of approval, some kind of confirmation that he wasn't making a mistake. He opened his mouth, but the words were caught. Then, finally, they spilled out, raw and honest. "I can't just sit here anymore. This isn't right." The bus seemed to hold its breath as Caleb's voice broke through the silence. The other passengers remained still, their eyes on him now, the unspoken weight of their complicity hanging between them. Eleanor's heart raced as she saw the shift. She could feel it, the ripple effect. She had seen this before, but now it felt different. Caleb's words, Lisa's courage, the slow dawning of realization. These were the seeds of change. These were the first signs that the silence could no longer be tolerated. Caleb's voice, shaky at first, grew stronger as he continued, looking at the passengers around him. "I'm not going to sit by and watch this happen. Not anymore. Not to her. Not to anyone." Eleanor didn't move, but inside, her heart soared. Caleb was speaking the truth. Lisa was speaking the truth, and the truth had a power all its own. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt the power of something beyond herself, something that was growing, a momentum that was pushing through the walls of silence she had spent so many years building. And for the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like she was standing alone. The bus rolled on, its engine whining against the pressure of the steep incline. But it wasn't the sound of the engine that dominated the air now. It was the tension. It hummed in the seats, heavy and palpable, like something waiting to break. Caleb stood, his breath shallow, but his heart pounding. Every inch of his body felt exposed, yet he had never felt more alive. He hadn't expected to stand up. He hadn't expected to speak out. He had only planned to stay quiet, to be like everyone else. But as his words spilled out into the thick silence, he felt as if a door had opened inside him, a door that had been locked shut for years. The bus seemed to hold its breath. The other passengers, still and silent, cast glances at him, but no one spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Eleanor watched from the back of the bus, her heart hammering in her chest. Caleb had done it. He had broken the silence. And in that moment, she realized something. Something she had forgotten in the years of being forced to endure injustice. The silence could be broken. It wasn't invincible. It was just a wall, and walls could be torn down. But Henry Blake, the driver, wasn't about to let things go so easily. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the worn leather. His face was contorted with rage, and his eyes flicked back to the rearview mirror, catching Caleb's defiant stance. For a moment, Henry seemed almost shocked. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected someone to stand up, to challenge him. But in his surprise, a deep well of anger began to bubble inside him. He had been in control for so long, no one had dared to speak back to him. "No one tells me what to do," Henry muttered under his breath, though his voice carried across the quiet bus. "Not today." He slammed the brakes suddenly, the bus jolting forward with such force that a few passengers gasped and lurched against the seats. Caleb almost stumbled but caught himself, his eyes never leaving Henry's in the rearview mirror. "You think you can just speak out like that?" Henry's voice cut through the air, sharper now, filled with venom. He turned in his seat to face Caleb, and the coldness in his eyes matched the harshness in his tone. "This is my bus. I run things here." Caleb stood his ground. "No, you don't," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension. "You don't run things when you're treating people like this. You don't run things when you think you can tell someone to sit at the back because of their skin. You don't run things when everyone else is too afraid to speak up." The words echoed in the space between them, the truth hanging heavy in the air. For a brief moment, Henry seemed to shrink back. His jaw clenched, and his hands tightened around the wheel. But then, the anger flared up again. "You think you're better than me, huh?" Henry snarled. "You think just because you opened your mouth, you're better than me?" "No," Caleb answered, shaking his head. "But I am better than this. We all are." The words hung between them, a challenge that neither of them could ignore. Henry's face reddened, and for a moment it seemed like he might snap, might do something reckless. But he stopped himself. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him now, their silent judgment weighing him down. He wasn't used to this, to being questioned. He had spent so long in control of the power dynamics, so long feeling untouchable. But now, in this cramped space, in front of these people who had been silent, he realized something. He wasn't in control anymore. For the first time, Henry looked away from Caleb, his gaze flickering to the rest of the passengers. The weight of their eyes, the quiet challenge in their stares, hit him harder than any words could. He could feel his power slipping away, and it scared him. The bus lurched again, this time not from Henry's frustration, but from the realization that things had changed. The passengers, who had been so silent moments before, were now shifting in their seats, glancing at each other. The quiet whispers of approval started to hum softly around the bus. It was a subtle shift, but it was enough. Eleanor noticed it first. She had been watching Henry, watching his every move. She had seen that moment of hesitation, that crack in the wall of his arrogance. And in that moment, she realized something else, something far more powerful than the anger that had fueled Henry's actions. The world could change. It had to change. Her eyes flicked toward Caleb, who still stood with quiet defiance, and then to Lisa, who had been silent up until now. Lisa was watching him with a look of something Eleanor hadn't expected to see: admiration. Lisa finally stood up, her feet shuffling slightly, her body stiff with nerves, but her voice rang out clear and strong. "What he's saying is right. We don't need to be afraid anymore." The words spilled out before Lisa could stop them, but once they were out, she couldn't take them back. She had never been someone to speak out, never someone who had challenged authority. But seeing Caleb, hearing his words, she realized she couldn't stay silent anymore. The silence had suffocated her for so long, and now, for the first time, she felt the power of her own voice. Henry's eyes darted between the two of them, his face twisting in confusion, disbelief, and, beneath it all, a touch of fear. "This is my bus," he shouted again, but his voice wavered, the words hollow in the air. "No, it's not," Lisa replied, her voice steady. "It's everyone's bus. And if you're going to treat people like this, you're going to have to answer for it." For the first time, there was no hesitation in the air. The silence had been broken, and the truth had been laid bare. Henry's hands shook slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but he couldn't find the words to respond. He was out of his depth now, unsure of how to regain control. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Eleanor felt something shift within her. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Henry, not of the passengers, not of the world that had tried to break her. She had been quiet for too long, but not anymore. She had witnessed too many others suffer in silence, too many voices lost in the din of a world that refused to listen. And for the first time, Eleanor felt the fire of change stirring inside her. The bus reached the next stop, but no one moved to get off. The passengers were waiting for someone to make the next move, waiting for something to happen. And Eleanor realized in that moment that the something was already happening. It was happening inside them. The passengers no longer saw her as the silent victim, the woman who would bend under the weight of injustice. They saw her as a symbol. And Caleb, standing tall now, was more than just a young man who had spoken up. He was a catalyst. Lisa, too, was no longer the quiet observer. She had found her voice. As the bus rolled on, the atmosphere in the vehicle shifted completely. The silent weight of fear had been replaced with something else, something far more powerful, the promise of change. And for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that change was possible. The bus pulled to a stop, its tires grinding against the pavement with a rough squeal, but no one moved. The passengers, once wrapped in their own worlds of silence and routine, now sat in a tense, still unity. The weight of what had just transpired hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and palpable. The words Caleb had spoken, "This is wrong," still reverberated in the confined space. For the first time, the passengers were forced to confront the reality of the injustice that had long gone unchallenged. Caleb's chest rose and fell with the deep breaths he was taking, as if trying to steady himself in the face of something far larger than he had anticipated. He stood there, not quite knowing what to do next, his hands clammy with nervous energy. But then his eyes met Eleanor's. Her gaze, once distant, now seemed more focused. There was a fire in her eyes, something he had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was a quiet strength, a resolve that Caleb couldn't quite place but knew he recognized. It was as though, in that moment, she had made a decision not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever suffered under the weight of silence. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades of unspoken words. "For speaking up." Caleb swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the moment. "I couldn't just sit there," he replied. the words feeling too small, too insignificant for the magnitude of what had just happened. Lisa, who had remained mostly silent until now, nodded firmly, her expression set with newfound purpose. "None of us should," she added, her voice steady, no longer uncertain. She turned to face Henry, whose knuckles were still white around the steering wheel, his face red with anger and frustration. "You're wrong," Lisa said simply, "and you know it." Henry's jaw clenched, his eyes wild as he met Lisa's unwavering stare in the rearview mirror. His hands twitched as though he might do something, anything, to reassert control. But the truth was, his power over this moment had already slipped through his fingers. The bus, once a silent vehicle of subjugation, was now a stage for something greater. Something had changed, not just within Caleb or Lisa, but within the very air of the bus. A shift, a spark, and it was spreading, slowly but surely. Henry took a deep, trembling breath and turned his eyes back to the road. For a moment it seemed like he might regain his composure, but there was an edge of something else in his eyes. A flicker of fear. Fear, for the first time in his life, of losing control. It wasn't about the bus. It wasn't even about Eleanor or Caleb. It was about something deeper. Henry had lived his life on the unchallenged belief that the world worked the way he saw it, that his superiority, his power, was inherent. But now, facing these young people, these voices raised against him, he realized how fragile that belief had been all along. For years, Henry had wielded his position with the ease of someone accustomed to domination. But today, that grip was slipping. It was slipping because someone had dared to speak up, and that was enough to shake everything he thought he knew. As the bus continued down the street, Eleanor felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The tension, which had been building for so long, was finally being addressed. She wasn't alone anymore. She hadn't been for a long time, but this moment felt different. She glanced at Caleb, who was still standing, his back straight. There was a rawness to his expression, but there was also something else. A quiet satisfaction. He had done it. He had said the words that needed to be said. And it wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for every person who had ever been silenced by fear. But the fight was far from over. The bus made its way through the heart of Birmingham, the scenery outside passing in a blur. Eleanor stared out the window, her thoughts racing, her heart still pounding from the encounter. For the first time in years, she felt as though she was seeing the world through new eyes. She wasn't just watching it pass by. She was a part of it, no longer content to sit quietly in the back, but ready to face whatever came next. As the bus neared the next stop, the door slid open with a soft whoosh. Eleanor took a deep breath, ready to face the world outside. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but for the first time, she was ready to walk it. But before she could move, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Caleb. "I'm with you," he said simply, his voice low but full of sincerity. Eleanor met his gaze, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This was the beginning, not just of a fight, but of something greater, a movement, a wave of change that started with one voice, one person willing to stand, and now more voices were joining in. Together, they were stronger. "Thank you," Eleanor said again, her voice quiet but filled with gratitude, "for not being afraid." Caleb smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I was afraid," he admitted, "but not anymore." The bus came to a stop again, and the doors opened. The passengers filed out one by one, their faces marked by the events that had unfolded. The silence that had once felt so suffocating had lifted, replaced by an air of uncertainty, yes, but also of hope. The journey that had begun on a tense note was now one that would lead them into uncharted territory. Eleanor followed Caleb and Lisa as they stepped off the bus, the bright sunlight casting long shadows on the pavement. The world outside seemed different now, brighter somehow, and filled with possibilities. She could feel the eyes of the world on her. But for the first time, they didn't feel like eyes of judgment. They felt like eyes of hope. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The following days felt like a ripple through water, a disturbance that continued to reverberate long after the initial splash. Eleanor hadn't realized how much she had been holding inside until the silence was broken. And now, as she walked through the streets of Birmingham, something had shifted. Something felt different. The city, which had once seemed so distant, so unchangeable, now felt alive, like it was responding to the actions of a few brave souls. Caleb's words on the bus had ignited something, but it wasn't just his words. It was the silence that had been broken, the silence that had stifled so many people for so long. As she walked past the shops, Eleanor noticed the small shifts, the way people looked at her, the way they no longer hurried past with their heads down. She'd spent so many years feeling like an invisible part of the landscape, but now she felt seen. Yet, even with this sense of change, Eleanor knew that the road ahead was not going to be easy. It never was. The next morning, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the sunlight spilling through the window, casting a soft glow across the worn wood of the table. She had always found peace in these quiet moments, the stillness of her home, the familiar hum of the city outside. But today, her thoughts were tangled, her mind far from calm. She picked up the newspaper, her eyes scanning the headlines as they blurred together. But then, one headline caught her eye, and she couldn't look away. Local bus driver under investigation after public confrontation. Her heart skipped a beat. The article described the events on the bus, detailing Caleb's words, Lisa's defiance, and Henry's subsequent suspension. The community was buzzing with reactions. Some people were supportive, others were critical, but the truth was undeniable. The incident had made waves. It had opened a conversation that had long been dormant. And that terrified Eleanor. She knew deep down that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was going to be hard, and the voices of those who had stayed silent for so long would now be forced to reckon with the consequences of their silence. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. She glanced at the clock. No one came by at this hour. Hesitantly, she stood up, the soft creak of the floorboards under her feet betraying her nerves. As she opened the door, she was surprised to see Caleb standing there, looking unsure but determined. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice hesitant but clear. Eleanor stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "Of course. You're always welcome here." They sat at the kitchen table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Eleanor could feel the weight of Caleb's discomfort, but she also sensed something more, something that told her he wasn't just here for a conversation. He had something he needed to say. Finally, after a long pause, Caleb spoke. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect it to go this far." He shook his head, his hand running through his hair. "I didn't expect the attention. It's just a bus ride, right? Just a moment. But it feels like, I don't know, like we've woken up something." Eleanor studied him carefully, the way his eyes flickered with uncertainty. "You did what needed to be done," she said quietly. "We all did. It's never just one moment. These things are built up, over years, over generations. The question now is, what do we do with it?" Caleb looked at her, his eyes searching as though looking for answers he didn't have. "I don't know. I thought if I spoke up I'd feel better, like I was doing something right. But now it feels like I've unleashed something bigger than me." Eleanor nodded. "You have. And that's the point, Caleb. We've all been living in this cycle of silence, and now the walls are cracking. But when the walls start cracking, things get messy. People get scared, and people will try to put it back the way it was. She paused, watching as Caleb absorbed her words. He looked like he was considering something, and Eleanor knew what it was, the choice that all of them would have to make sooner or later. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Caleb asked, his voice small, almost as if asking permission. Eleanor reached across the table, placing her hand gently on his. "There is no one right thing," she said softly. "But you spoke your truth. That's what matters. That's what changes everything. The rest will come." Caleb nodded slowly, but the weight in his eyes didn't fade. "But what if people turn on us? What if they come after us?" Eleanor's heart ached for him. She could hear the fear in his voice, the same fear she had lived with for years, the fear that speaking out would bring nothing but pain. But she also knew that this was a moment, a defining moment, not just for Caleb, but for all of them. "You don't change the world by staying silent," she said firmly. "You change it by standing up, by showing the world that you are not afraid. They may try to silence you, but that's only because they're scared of what happens when the truth gets loud." The conversation stretched into the afternoon, with Caleb asking questions and Eleanor offering her insights, guiding him through the uncertainty that came with taking a stand. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Eleanor knew their time together was coming to an end. She could see the determination in Caleb's eyes. He was ready to take the next step. But the question remained, would the world be ready to follow? As Caleb stood to leave, Eleanor walked with him to the door. He paused, his hand on the knob, and turned to face her one last time. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Eleanor smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "No one can do this alone, Caleb. We do it together, or we don't do it at all." As he walked down the steps and into the street, Eleanor watched him go, her mind already turning toward what came next. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next day, as Eleanor walked through the neighborhood, the weight of what was happening became more and more evident. People were talking, people she had never spoken to before, people she had never noticed before. The ripple effect was undeniable. People were waking up. She was approached by a woman she didn't recognize, a woman in her late 30s, wearing a uniform from a local store. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the woman said, "for what happened on the bus. It's hard, you know. We've all been silent for so long, but you showed us that we don't have to be." Eleanor was taken aback for a moment, but then she smiled softly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "You're welcome," Eleanor said, her voice steady but full of the emotion that was building inside her. "But it's not just me. It's all of us. We're just beginning." As Eleanor walked on, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a responsibility, a call to action. The silence had been broken. The time for change was now, and she was ready. The days following the confrontation on the bus felt like an unrelenting tide, rolling steadily forward with a force that was impossible to ignore. Eleanor had become a quiet symbol in her community, a figure whose courage had sparked something far bigger than a single moment of defiance. Her voice had been heard, but it wasn't just hers anymore. It was the voice of the many, those who had spent years, decades even, silenced by fear and oppression. But the aftermath was messy. People in the neighborhood began talking. Some voiced their support, while others hesitated, unsure of what speaking out might cost them. The news had spread quickly, and with it, a wave of tension had followed. It wasn't just the story on the bus anymore. It was a story that reflected the larger societal issues festering just beneath the surface, issues that were now too loud to ignore. Eleanor walked through the city streets, each step resonating with the weight of history. The world seemed different now, as if every interaction carried more significance. People who had once looked past her, ignoring her presence, now met her gaze. Some nodded in recognition, others lingered just a moment too long, as if unsure how to act around her now. As she walked into her local grocery store that morning, she could feel the subtle shift. The air felt charged with the sense that something was changing, but the uncertainty still hung there like a cloud. Eleanor wasn't sure what that change would look like yet, but she knew it was coming. And then she saw the woman again, the one who had approached her a few days earlier. "Miss Sanders?" the woman called from the vegetable aisle, her voice hesitant but warm. She was in her late 30s, with a worn but kind face. Eleanor recognized her now, a regular at the store, though they had never spoken before. Eleanor turned and smiled, offering a small nod. "Yes?" The woman hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "I just wanted to thank you for what happened on the bus. I didn't think anyone would ever say something. I've been so afraid all my life, just keeping my head down." Eleanor's heart ached at the woman's words. She saw the years of fear and submission in her eyes, the same fear she had carried for too long. "You don't have to thank me," Eleanor said softly. "I just spoke up. But you've been living with that fear for far too long. It's time we all stopped hiding." The woman looked down for a moment, a mix of gratitude and uncertainty written across her face. Then she met Eleanor's gaze again. "I think I'm ready to speak up too," she said, her voice quieter now, but filled with resolve. Eleanor nodded, feeling the spark of something greater ignite within her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about Caleb or Lisa. It was about the community, about the people who had been suffering in silence for too long, and they were starting to find their voices. Later that evening, as Eleanor sat on her porch, a soft breeze blowing through the trees, she reflected on everything that had happened. The weight of her own silence had been lifted, but it wasn't just her silence that had been broken. It was the silence of a community, of people who had been taught to fear their own voices. Now they were waking up. She didn't know where this would lead, but she could feel it. Change was coming, slow but steady. It wasn't just a single moment. It was a series of moments, a chain reaction that had begun and couldn't be stopped. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Eleanor looked up to see Caleb walking toward her, his face serious but determined. He stopped in front of her, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting her gaze. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, his voice steady but laced with something deeper, an anxiety that Eleanor recognized well. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Caleb took a deep breath, his gaze still lingering on the ground. "I've been getting calls. People have been asking about what happened on the bus and—" Eleanor nodded. "It's starting to spread. The community's starting to talk." He looked up at her, his eyes wide. "It's more than just talk, though. People are starting to ask me what's next. They're asking me what we're going to do about it." Eleanor sat back in her chair, letting the weight of his words settle in. She had known this moment would come, the moment when talking wasn't enough anymore, when silence could no longer be justified. The question of what to do next wasn't just Caleb's to answer. It was all of theirs. "People are ready," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "They're ready to do more than talk. They're ready to act." Caleb nodded slowly, his fingers running through his hair as he looked out across the street. I don't know what the next step is. I thought speaking up was enough. But now it feels like we have to do something bigger." Eleanor smiled gently, a quiet understanding passing between them. Speaking up was the first step. But now we need to keep moving forward. We need to turn the conversation into action. Caleb turned back to her, his eyes filled with questions, uncertainty still lingering. But how? What can we really do? Eleanor stood up, walking toward him. It starts with this. It starts with more of us standing up. And then it spreads. We need to show people that they're not alone, that there's power in numbers, power in our collective voice. The wind picked up slightly, the sound of the rustling leaves adding a sense of urgency to her words. Caleb seemed to take a deep breath, the weight of the responsibility beginning to settle into his chest. "I think you're right," he said slowly, his voice gaining strength. "It's not enough to just talk about it. We need to show them what it looks like to stand up." Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. And I think you're ready for that. You've already taken the first step." Caleb smiled faintly, the unease still there, but replaced by a growing sense of purpose. "I never thought I'd be the one leading the charge. But maybe it's time." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes meeting his with pride. "No one leads alone. We'll all do this together." The days that followed were a blur of conversations, meetings, and planning. Word of the bus confrontation spread like wildfire, and people began to gather, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Caleb, Lisa, and Eleanor met regularly to discuss the next steps, what actions they could take, how they could organize their community, how they could amplify their voices. And all the while the question loomed, would they have the strength to carry it through? On the streets, in the quiet corners of their neighborhoods, change was brewing. Eleanor felt it in her bones. It wasn't just the words anymore. It was the actions that would follow. It was the courage to stand together and demand the dignity they all deserved. And the spark, once ignited, was unstoppable. The streets of Birmingham felt different now, quieter in some ways, but charged with a new energy that crackled beneath the surface. The buzz of the city seemed to pulse with the weight of something new, something that had been awakened. Eleanor had never expected to be at the center of this change, but here she was, standing in the middle of a whirlwind she had helped start. It had been 2 weeks since the bus incident. 2 weeks since Caleb, Lisa, and she had taken the first steps toward a change that felt as monumental as it was terrifying. The community had begun to stir. People were talking, questioning, and most importantly, taking action. But the consequences were beginning to take shape too. There were whispers in the neighborhood, both supportive and skeptical. A few of her neighbors came to her door, nodding silently, offering a few words of encouragement. Others, like Mrs. Taylor across the street, had made it clear that they didn't think it was the right way to handle things. The divide was clear, and it wasn't going to be an easy battle. Eleanor stood in her small kitchen, the morning light filtering through the window as she stared down at her phone. The screen displayed an email from a local news outlet asking for an interview. She had expected it. She had known that attention would follow the story, that the eyes of the city, and possibly the nation, would be trained on her. Her finger hovered over the screen. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of everyone's expectations bearing down on her. It wasn't just about what had happened anymore. It was about what would come next. Before she could click the email open, the sound of footsteps approaching the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She stood still, trying to steady her breath, knowing exactly who it was. Caleb's knock was gentle but firm, and before she could respond, he opened the door. He was still in the same clothes from his shift, his face a little more worn than the last time she saw him. But there was something different about him now. The uncertainty had faded, replaced with a quiet strength that had become more noticeable each day. "Morning," he said, his voice steady. "Morning, Caleb." Eleanor smiled softly, though she could feel the weight of their shared silence, heavy and unspoken. He stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood at the window, gazing out over the street, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Eleanor knew what he was thinking. She could read it in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed. He was no longer that hesitant young man who had stood up in the bus, questioning himself and his place in the world. He had made a decision, and now he was grappling with the reality of it. "Things are getting serious," he said after a long pause. He turned to face her, his eyes dark with concern. "I didn't think it would go this far." Eleanor nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on the table in front of her. "I think we all knew it would, eventually. We've got people talking, but we've also got people angry. A lot of people," Caleb said, his voice thick with the weight of it all. "I didn't expect it to be this hard, to feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder." Eleanor took a deep breath, her mind racing as she thought about the same fears. Every day, the weight of what they had started bore down on her more. The media had picked up the story, but so had the critics. There were people in their community who wanted to ignore the truth, pretend it didn't exist, the ones who were content with things the way they were. She walked over to Caleb, placing a hand on his arm. The gesture was simple, but it carried everything she wanted to say. "You can't control what other people think, Caleb. All we can do is keep moving forward. That's the only way." He met her gaze, the uncertainty still flickering in his eyes. "And if it backfires, what if we're making things worse?" Eleanor squeezed his arm gently. "Then we deal with it. Together." The day dragged on, and though the afternoon sun bathed the neighborhood in warmth, Eleanor felt the cold weight of the world closing in. She had spent hours thinking, strategizing, trying to figure out what to do next. It was becoming clear that this was no longer a local issue, it was becoming a movement. The news was picking up speed, and while that brought with it a sense of excitement, it also carried a weight she wasn't entirely prepared for. The evening was a blur of phone calls and messages, some from supporters, others from critics. She had begun to realize how dangerous it could be to open a door that had been closed for so long. There were those who didn't want change. There were those who wanted to silence them, to put things back to the way they were. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the phone rang again. It was Lisa. "Eleanor," Lisa's voice came through the receiver, tight with urgency. "I think we're in trouble." Eleanor's heart skipped. "What happened?" I just got a call from someone at the local news station. They said there's a petition going around to have us..." She hesitated. "To have us arrested, for public disruption." The words landed like a punch in the stomach. "What? Are you serious?" "I don't know who started it, but it's moving fast," Lisa continued. "And some of the people from the neighborhood, people we've known for years, are signing it." Eleanor could hear the fear in Lisa's voice, but she also heard something else, a quiet determination. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know yet," Lisa said. "But we need to meet. We need to figure this out." Eleanor paused, her mind racing. "All right, I'll be there. Don't worry. We'll handle it." She hung up the phone and stood still, her mind heavy with the realization that this was no longer just about standing up for what was right. It was about surviving in a world that was pushing back harder than she ever imagined. But as she stared out the window into the night, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to back down. No one was. The meeting that evening felt surreal. They gathered at the local community center, a small room tucked away on the edge of the neighborhood, dimly lit but full of energy. It was the kind of place where people came for support, for solidarity. And tonight, that's exactly what they needed. Caleb, Lisa, and a few others stood around a table, the weight of the petition hanging over them. The room was quiet, each person digesting the news, feeling the reality of what they had started. "It's just a petition, right?" Caleb asked, though his voice was tinged with doubt. "It's not just a petition," Lisa replied, her voice steady but filled with concern. "This is what happens when people are scared. They fight back. They'll do anything to stop this from spreading." Eleanor looked around the room at the people gathered, people who had all taken a step towards something bigger, something that couldn't be taken back. They were united by one common thread, the belief that change was possible. She felt her own resolve harden. We have to keep moving forward. We can't stop just because people are scared. They would fight. They would speak louder. They would not go back into the shadows. The following morning, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city streets. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with the anticipation of something waiting to happen. Eleanor stood at her window, looking out at the neighborhood, her thoughts clouded with a mixture of concern and determination. The petition had taken on a life of its own, a spark that had ignited a firestorm of opposition. People she had known for years, neighbors, co-workers, even friends, had signed it. They were calling for them to be punished for causing public disruption, for standing up and speaking out. But what troubled Eleanor the most was not the petition itself. It was the message behind it, that change was something to be feared, that the world should remain exactly as it had been, no matter the cost. She had always known that standing up for what was right wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected it to come at the cost of her relationships with people she had trusted. The words she had spoken on that bus had reverberated throughout the community, and while some had supported her, many others had retreated into silence. It was the silence that hurt the most. She turned away from the window, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. She had known this would happen. She had known that at some point the voices of resistance would face opposition. What she hadn't prepared for was the emotional toll it would take on her, the isolation, the feeling that no matter how many people they reached, the ones who mattered, the ones she had relied on, were slipping away. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She moved toward the door, her feet heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. When she opened it, she found Caleb standing there, his face grim. He didn't need to speak for Eleanor to know the reason for his visit. "They're moving fast," Caleb said, his voice tight. "The petition's gaining traction, and now they're organizing protests. Some of the people who signed it are demanding that we be publicly shamed, that we be made an example of." Eleanor nodded, her heart sinking. She had expected this escalation, but it still felt like a blow to the chest. "We can't back down now," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tide of uncertainty inside her. "We can't let them control the narrative." Caleb stepped into the house, looking around as if trying to find the words to say what they both knew. "They're trying to make it seem like we're the problem," he said quietly. "Like we're the ones causing the trouble. But we're not. We're just asking for what's always been denied." Eleanor felt a flicker of hope at his words, but it was quickly overshadowed by the fear that still gripped her heart. "It's not just about asking for something anymore. We're challenging the system itself, Caleb. And that's dangerous." "I know," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of it all. "But if we don't do it now, when will we?" She didn't have an answer for him, but she knew the truth of it. If they didn't act now, the silence would swallow them whole. The world would remain unchanged. They would remain unchanged. The meeting at the community center later that evening was a turning point. As the sun set and the streets around them grew darker, more people began to trickle in. Some came quietly, unsure of what to expect. Others were already talking in low voices, murmuring about the petition, about the protests, about the consequences of standing up to a system that had always worked in their favor. The small room was filled with anxious energy, but there was also a sense of purpose, a quiet resolve that Eleanor hadn't seen before. The people who had gathered weren't just there out of obligation. They were there because they believed in the cause. They understood that this was bigger than any one person. This was about the future. This was about change. Caleb, standing at the front of the room, looked at the group with a mixture of hope and fear. "We're facing a lot of opposition," he began, his voice strong despite the weight of the words. "But we can't let that stop us. This is our moment. We've spoken up, but now we need to act." Eleanor stood next to him, her gaze sweeping across the room. She could feel the collective energy, the spark of something powerful starting to burn. But she also knew that it was fragile, that it could be snuffed out with the wrong move. "The petition and the protests are only the beginning," she said, her voice clear. "They're trying to intimidate us. They want us to be afraid. But we can't let fear dictate our actions. We have to be smarter. We have to be louder. We have to make them listen." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the group. Then, slowly, one by one, hands began to rise. People began to speak, offering their support, their ideas, and their willingness to stand beside Eleanor and Caleb. It was small at first, just a few voices, but then it grew until the room was filled with a chorus of solidarity. "We need to show them we're not backing down," one of the older men, Mr. Robinson, said. "We've been quiet for too long. It's time we take a stand. No more hiding in the shadows." Eleanor felt a surge of hope in that moment. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe together they could do this. But just as the conversation was picking up steam, a loud bang on the door interrupted them. The sound was so abrupt, so forceful, that it jolted everyone to attention. Caleb's face immediately hardened. He walked toward the door and opened it, revealing a group of men standing outside. They were well dressed, their expressions cold and unyielding. "We need to talk," one of the men said, his voice low and authoritative. "We represent some of the community members who are concerned about the actions being taken here. You're causing unrest, and it's time to put an end to it." Eleanor could feel the tension in the room. The atmosphere shifted, the air growing thick with hostility. The group of men was there to intimidate, to remind them of their place. But Eleanor wasn't afraid anymore, not like she had been before. "You don't get to tell us what we can and cannot do," she said, stepping forward. "This isn't about you. This is about us, and we're not going to stop." The men exchanged looks, their faces unreadable. Finally, the leader spoke again. "We'll see about that." With that, they turned and walked away, leaving a chilling silence in their wake. As the door closed, the room was eerily quiet. But it wasn't fear that hung in the air. It was resolve. They had crossed a line. There was no going back now. Caleb turned to Eleanor, his expression firm. "This is it, isn't it?" She nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling in. "Yes, this is it." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. The protests grew, the petitions spread, and the movement Eleanor had set in motion gathered momentum. The tension in the air was thick with uncertainty, but there was also something else, something far more powerful than fear. It was hope. It was the belief that together they could create something better. Eleanor stood on the steps of the community center one morning, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. It was a quiet gathering, but the energy in the air was unmistakable. People were talking, laughing, even crying together. There were young faces and old, people from all walks of life, each one united by a simple, powerful belief. Change was possible. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight for their right to be heard, for their right to stand up and say, "We matter." And it was in this moment, as she watched the crowd, that Eleanor realized just how far they had come. They had been afraid once, but they were no longer afraid. They were united, and together they could face whatever came next. Caleb walked up beside her, his face tired but filled with determination. He had been by her side every step of the way, and it was clear to Eleanor that his growth had mirrored her own. He had come so far from the uncertain young man who had stood up on that bus. Now he was a leader in his own right. "We've made it this far," Caleb said, his voice calm but steady. "But it's only the beginning. We've got to keep pushing." Eleanor nodded, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We will. This is just the start, but we've already made a difference." The crowd's energy was palpable, a collective breath held, waiting for what was to come. As Eleanor stepped forward to speak, the crowd grew quiet. She could feel their eyes on her, but this time there was no fear. There was only hope. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying across the group. "Thank you for standing with us, for standing for each other. We've come a long way, but the road ahead is still long. There will be obstacles, there will be setbacks, but if we keep walking together, we will make it. Together, we are stronger. Together, we will be heard." Her words echoed in the quiet air, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the beating hearts of those who had gathered. Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She knew that this was more than just a movement. It was a moment of unity, of collective strength. As the crowd began to disperse, people came up to Eleanor to thank her, to share their own stories, to tell her how they had been inspired to speak up. The faces around her were different now, more determined, more connected. The silence that had once defined them was no longer their burden to carry. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor continued to hear stories of change. A woman in a nearby neighborhood had organized a rally of her own. A teacher had incorporated lessons on activism and justice into her classroom. A local restaurant had begun offering scholarships to young black students, a small but powerful way of giving back to the community. It was in these stories, these acts of kindness and solidarity, that Eleanor saw the true impact of their efforts. It wasn't just about protesting. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about creating a culture of kindness, of standing up for each other, of speaking out when something wasn't right. And Eleanor knew that, in the end, that was the kind of change that would last. As the movement grew, so did the conversations around it. People were no longer afraid to ask questions, to discuss the issues that had been buried for so long. And Eleanor, as tired as she was, knew that every conversation, every challenge, was a step forward. And so, as the chapter of this particular struggle began to close, a new one was beginning to take shape. A chapter of healing, of growth, of change. The world was still flawed, still broken in so many ways, but there was a sense of purpose now, a belief that, if they stood together, they could create a better future for their children, for their neighbors, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. To all of you who have joined us on this journey, thank you. Your voices, your support, have made all the difference. The fight isn't over, but together we've proven that change is possible. And if you believe in this message, in the power of unity and love, please share it. Leave a comment below and tell us how you've been inspired to take action in your own community. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our future stories. We are just getting started, and your voice matters. Together, we can continue to change the world, one step at a time. Thank you for standing with us.